Hey everybody, and welcome to Database Camp. In today's video, I'm going to be continuing my reading of Racism in America. By the way, I forget to mention that it is a free ebook, so it is available for download. You can download it in the PDF form. I think they have two other different formats, but if you are interested in reading this book for yourself, I will be including the link below down in the description, as well as my first video that I made regarding this book. If you wanted to know a little bit more background about it, I will be including the link to my first video down below as well. So in the first video, I talk a little bit more about the book. I talk about what inspired me to make this series of reading this book on my YouTube channel. And I also read the foreword in that first video. So if you're interested in any of that, you could just click on the link below, and all that information is in the first video. So in this video, I'm going to be reading the fifth excerpt, and it is titled Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I by I-Adriane Lentz-Smith. So a little bit of background. The American Expeditionary Forces in World War I included 200,000 black soldiers whose experiences in Europe led them to imagine a world beyond Jim Crow. In tracing the efforts of these soldiers to gain full citizenship rights as recompense for military service, I-Adriane Lentz-Smith illuminates how World War I mobilized a generation. Battered by the harsh realities of segregation, African Americans fought their own war for democracy, reworking notions of nation and belonging. Here, the author recounts the tragic fate of an African American U.S. Army sergeant in Jim Crow, Alabama. The ride from Hobson City, Alabama, to neighboring Anniston would carry Edgar Caldwell to the gallows. On a Sunday afternoon, about a month after the armistice and 10 days before Christmas in December 1918, Caldwell boarded a streetcar on the Alabama Power Company's Constantine line. A sergeant at Camp McClellan, he carried a pass that allowed him to leave his post, located 8 miles outside of Anniston, to spend an afternoon in Hobson City, the all-black town on the city's southern outskirts. He wore the khaki and wool uniform of a non-commissioned Army officer. Nice clothes, a witness would later call them. Chevron stripes indicating his rank, and a military-issue hat. Unseen, tucked in his clothes, he carried a pistol. Even as racial activists and white supremacists speculated on what to expect from soldiers returning from service in Europe, a black soldier in Alabama lashed out against Jim Crow at home. An everyday argument between the soldier and a white transportation worker in Alabama would lead to a murder trial that became a cause célèbre. It began when Sergeant Caldwell, a former member of the 24th Infantry, then serving in an Alabama labor battalion, boarded the streetcar and immediately butted heads with the conductor, Cecil Lenton. There, Jim Crow argument grew into a fight, and the fight ended with Lenton dead and white motorman Kelsey Morrison wounded. Within a month, civilian authorities had tried Caldwell in Alabama State Court and convicted him of murder. They sentenced him to death by hanging. In the months that followed, Sergeant Caldwell's murder case wended a path through the state and federal court systems, resulting in the April 1920 Supreme Court ruling Caldwell v. Parker on military power and federal jurisdiction. As it traveled from Calhoun County to the nation's capital, the case allowed African Americans to pull back from their international imaginaries and give shape to the national realities in which their internationalisms were rooted. Through Caldwell, African Americans engaged questions of federal citizenship, states' rights, criminal procedure, and the limits of white supremacy in wartime. They pushed the Wilson administration to define Caldwell's citizenship in such a way that the state of Alabama could not confine him. Caldwell's case captured the spirit of both returning soldiers and the African American troops who had served in stateside camps. Just days after Caldwell's arrest, a fellow sergeant in the 157th Depot Brigade wrote an open letter to his comrades, mustering out of the Army at Camp Gordon near Atlanta, Georgia. Lauding the troops' development into the equal or superior of any troops that ever wore the khaki uniform, he anticipated that after having realized their manhood through military service, they would never again consent to sit aside while the neighboring white man gets possession of all the spoils. The sergeant, Wellington Dixon, predicted a competition between black men and white men for the wealth, the education, and the political rights of the country. Wealth, education, and political rights provided the foundations for an active citizenship, one that could allow for African American participation in public politics. But with the Caldwell case, they fought for something more elementary. If even passive citizens enjoyed the right of protection of their person, of their property, of their liberty, etc., set forth in 19th century liberal doctrine, then blacks had not yet cleared the first hurdle. By defending Caldwell, African Americans defended their own freedom not to be lynched in the town square or railroaded in the courtroom. They fought for what Eli Green would have called the right of law. Using arguments over military jurisdiction that suggested that Sergeant Caldwell's rights should have been his to keep no matter where he traveled, Caldwell's defenders looked to the Army to protect black citizenship. Like the activists in Paris who claimed black soldiers' efforts for all the race, African Americans involved in the Caldwell case linked their fate to his. Edgar Caldwell's solitary act of self-defense served only as prologue. What followed was a grander story of community, vision, and mobilization, as black people in cities across the country used the circumstances created by the war to push the federal government to protect one of their and its own. The first racial trouble of any kind. Stepping out on that Sunday afternoon, December 15, 1918, Caldwell must have found his day off a welcome respite. Troops in Caldwell's labor battalion worked just as hard as those in Virginia or St. Nazaire, and things did not slack off with the armistice. Since their transfer from Camp Gordon to Camp McClellan earlier in the fall, the Army had worked him and the other 5,000 African American troops assigned to the 157th Depot Brigade to the bone. Now that the war had ended, they were no longer given military training. Instead, they worked from dusk to dawn, doing heavy labor, hauling lumber, building roads, and cleaning up debris. Exhausted at day's end, they piled into tents plagued by shoddy construction, crowded conditions, and poor sanitation. The soldiers at Camp McClellan may have comforted themselves with the knowledge that things could have been worse. In colder camps, for example, men reportedly died like sheep, when poor quarters and inadequate clothing exposed them to the excesses of winter. When weather did not kill black soldiers in other camps, excessively cruel treatment often did. Complaints of African American soldiers in Anniston could barely rival those of troops in Camp Humphreys, Virginia, where sergeants were armed and told to shoot the damn if they could not rule them any other way, or of the service battalion working at a warehouse in Schenectady, New York, whose dictatorial major dragged sick men out of the hospital to unload supply cars. Still, conditions at Camp McClellan took their toll on morale. In the stockade in the winter of 1918, a black civilian lay dying of pneumonia, held without charge or trial for allegedly making disloyal remarks in violation of the Wartime Sedition Act. Local authorities had turned him over to the military with no regard for habeas corpus. And just days before Caldwell took his fatal ride on the streetcar, an African American draftee compared his own condition to incarceration. He wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois that African American soldiers were being held at Camp McClellan to do all the fatigue work while thousands of white soldiers were sent home. He asked that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, help them procure honorable discharges. We don't want to disgrace or mar our fine record, the weary soldier stated simply, but we must have relief. As a sergeant, Caldwell stood somewhere between the enlisted men who labored in the worst conditions and the handful of black commissioned officers whose lighter load and superior quarters were offset by the contempt of troops who scorned them as accommodationist. An experienced soldier, he might have reconciled himself to the discomforts of military life, but as events would show, he had not yet come to accept the daily injustices of Jim Crow. Neither experience nor rank could cushion Caldwell from the tedium that overlay life in Camp McClellan. Soldiers stationed stateside had no Paris to which they could escape, or imagine escaping. They had little to help them push back on the closing walls of white supremacy. Apart from a handful of baseball teams, camp life provided black soldiers in Anniston with few recreational outlets. They had little access to the corn liquor produced by moonshiners in the nearby hills, and given their distance from the city, even less opportunity to meet black civilians. When they could get to town, they found that the area's African American churches had organized few programs for their benefit. Soldiers might approach young women in Anniston's African American neighborhoods, but with 80 girls arrested for immoral conduct between July and November 1918, prostitution and public courting came under harsh regulation. The influenza pandemic that spread in late 1918 isolated the troops even more, as a camp-wide quarantine kept most soldiers on base and most visitors off. Occasionally, soldiers still made it downtown to attend the social club, half-heartedly, established for them by the War Camp Community Service. Run by a Baptist minister, the club had writing tables and stationery but no piano or record player. All the same, by December, soldiers would have craved even the small diversion this provided. For all its hardships, Sergeant Caldwell's Army service had brought its rewards. Unlike some of the lower-ranked enlisted men who went for months before receiving a clothing issue of fatigues, Caldwell could sport his non-commissioned officer's uniform when he went to town. Though there were no fights over white girlfriends to spark racial showdowns, the same tensions that animated black soldiers' interactions with white soldiers in Europe guided encounters here, and in Anniston, the civilian population enforced Jim Crow as forcefully as the Army did, if not more so. Yet as Caldwell boarded the streetcar, he dressed as if no one had a claim to him except for Uncle Sam himself. The hat, the uniform, the pistol functioned as armor for a black officer aboard a segregated streetcar. As a principal theater for the performance and enforcement of racial mores, public transportation repeatedly served to remind African Americans of their assigned place in the Southern caste system. Yet at the same time, streetcars also provided African Americans with an opportunity to challenge publicly, through gestures small and large, white supremacist notions of that place. Born in 1889 into the Greenwood, South Carolina landscape where populism failed and Ben Tillman triumphed, Caldwell knew the circumscription and denigration that set the boundaries of black life in the Progressive era South. However, having served as a soldier both in the present war and 5 years earlier as a member of the proud 24th Infantry stationed in the Philippines, he also knew places and possibilities more expansive than those presented by Jim Crow. Cloaked in the uniform of the United States Army, Caldwell gestured toward an identity as a citizen, and toward the honor and respect denied him merely as an African American man. For just this reason, the sight of dark brown Caldwell in his army khakis must have appeared to a white country boy from Alabama like a red flag to a bull. Older white Anistonians had the memory of the black troops stationed near Anniston during the Spanish, Cuban, and Philippines wars to help them adjust to uniform African American men in their city. Streetcar conductor Cecil Lenton, young and newly arrived in town from rural Linville, did not. Whether Caldwell truly waltzed aboard and insisted on sitting on the head of the car, in the section set aside for the use of white passengers, as the white newspapers claimed, or had simply refused to let Cecil Lenton cheat him of his fare, as some black commentators later insisted, his dress and manner flouted the tenets of white supremacy that gave order to Linton's world. To Caldwell's silent, glaring provocation, the young conductor responded by striking the soldier twice in the face. As passengers watched, Caldwell fought back. "I heard the window crash," a white witness recalled later, "and I jumped up on the seat to see what it was." He stood up in time to watch Linton, aided by his motorman, Kelsey Morrison, force Caldwell to the back of the car and shove him out the rear and onto the street. Having harshly reminded Caldwell of his place, the crew proceeded to punish him for forgetting it. As the motorman Morrison moved to strike, one newspaper claimed, with a heavy piece of iron, Caldwell allegedly drew his pistol from his pocket and fired twice with lethal precision. The first bullet entered Linton's chin and crashed through the top of his head. The second passed close to Kelsey Morrison's heart, leaving him alive but desperately wounded. With passengers charging from the streetcar to apprehend him, Caldwell fled the scene, heading south toward the hills outside the city. Yet Sergeant Caldwell's status as a soldier still in uniform, rather than a discharged veteran, affected what might happen to him. Camp McClellan's Colonel Lewis surrendered Caldwell and then protected him because the colonel and his fellow officers had to strike a difficult balance in dealing with the shooting their own soldiers and the civilian community. Their camp had already weathered a few scandals. During Camp McClellan's construction in 1917, workers purportedly organized by the industrial workers of the world had put a local face on wartime labor unrest. In the late days of 1918, some troops, too, had given in to their restlessness by purchasing fake discharges from a corrupt junior officer. Others, like white Georgian Thomas Goebel, simply went AWOL, slipping into the Georgia mountains and disguising himself as a woman to elude civilian bosses. African American soldiers also yearned for release. Even without the violence on the streetcar, Camp McClellan experienced taut social relations. Given the tensions outside of camp, the Army had to tread lightly. On the one hand, Army officials recognized the suspicion with which some Southerners viewed the intrusion and upheaval of a national army and military camps throughout the South. With peace as yet unofficial, the Army could little afford to alienate local people over a black soldier who had shot two white men, especially when white soldiers who shared Anistonians' outrage roamed the streets alongside civilians. At the same time, however, Army officials could not cede all of their authority to a mob, civilian or military. To allow Alabamans to lynch a soldier on active duty would mock the principle of discipline so critical to military order and lessen the authority of the Army itself. By bringing in Caldwell, but guarding him until he could go to civilian trial, Colonel Lewis appeased the mob while asserting the Army's power. Throughout the war, military and federal officials would repeatedly seek to manage the competing demands of local interest, federal power, and international clout. In Anniston, they did so by helping to rush Caldwell's case to trial. Over the next few days, the streetcar shooting remained the main topic of conversation in the city, as authorities moved to deal with Caldwell before the mob could. Frankly and formally, Caldwell described his position in a letter to his commanding officer. "It gives me great pleasure to write to you," he announced the morning after his arrest, "that I am in trouble." Stripped of his uniform and outfitted in overalls, he wrote back to camp from a cell in the county jail. The night before, he had admitted to his military interrogators that he had fought with Linton and Morrison on the Oxford Line car, but he steadfastly claimed that someone else fired the shots that left the conductor dead and the motorman wounded. Caldwell knew that his denial came to no avail. Served with an arrest warrant on the morning after his capture, he wrote his officer that he was to be tried for murder. Through the combined efforts of the military, city, and county police, the case proceeded, in the words of an impressed reporter, with a speed seldom witnessed in criminal investigations. The day after the shooting, as members of the local streetcar workers' union accompanied Linton's body back home for burial and doctors announced that Morrison would probably survive despite his wounds, Calhoun County Circuit Court Judge Hugh Merrill called a special meeting for the grand jury for Thursday, December 19th. He assigned as defense counsel a local lawyer, Charles D. Klein, and set Wednesday as the day of the soldiers' preliminary hearing. The whites took this assurance of a speedy trial as a sign that there would be no dilly-dallying in punishing Linton's killer. Although the rapid response of local authorities lessened the potential for mob violence, public fascination was at a peak by the time Caldwell arrived for his bail hearing on Wednesday morning. The initial hearing pulled a big crowd of curious onlookers who thronged the courtroom to watch as 15 witnesses, mostly soldiers, recounted Sunday's events. The crowd became so engrossed in the drama of the trial that when the first streetcar passengers identified Caldwell as the man who shot Cecil Lenton, some people applauded. At the end of the day, after Judge Merrill declared that he could do nothing less than hold the defendant for the grand jury without bond, the crowd trailed Caldwell and his protective guard of sheriff's agents, city police, and military men back to the jail. If anything happened to Caldwell before he made it to trial, they wanted to be there to see it. While the mob watched over Caldwell in the street, Alabama government and industry came together in the courthouse to build their case for the grand jury. The Alabama Power Company, employer of Caldwell's 2 victims, retained its Anniston counsel, Knox, Acker, Dixon, and Stern, to aid the prosecution. An eminent lawyer and Yale Law School alumnus, Neil Stern served as the big gun in a 3-man prosecutorial team rounded out by the county attorney and a state solicitor sent up from Talladega to assist in the proceedings. Vowing to the public that no effort would be spared to ensure that full justice was done in the case, Stern and his associates entered the fray over the meaning of justice for Edgar Caldwell. In many ways, Stern, praised by his peers as a man of much courage, good sense, and humor, represented the most benign face of Anniston's white supremacist elite. A local boy, his roots in Anniston dated back almost to its opening as a public town in the early 1880s. In 1887, 4 years after Anniston ceased being a closed factory settlement, Stern's father, Anselm, moved his wife and children, including 3-year-old Neil, to the fledgling town in the Alabama hills. To the elder Stern, himself a Jewish immigrant from the German state of Westphalia, the move from Albany, Georgia, to northern Alabama would have seemed short but significant. As a veteran of the ravaged Confederate Army, he could have found in industrial Anniston, founded in 1872 the promise of a revitalized South. Indeed, the Stearns would prosper as the city grew. Anselm became a wealthy grocer, a city alderman, a Mason, and a lifelong member of the United Confederate Veterans. As he wove the family into the fabric of the city through business and community networks, his wife Henrietta extended their ties through public service and participation. A dedicated clubwoman and founder of the Anniston's Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Society, Henrietta acted as a leader in the town's small Jewish community while becoming the honorary life president of the local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, UDC. His parents and their civic activities provided Neil Stern with a model of Southern place and race-making, as they regrouped from the Civil War's material devastation, sanctified the lost cause, and firmly ensconced themselves in the Anniston community as Jews certainly, but first and foremost as white Southerners. If the elder Sterns hearkened back to the Old South, Neil Stern unquestionably evoked the new. Unlike his father, who had fought in Stonewall Jackson's army, Neil served under a more successful defender of white supremacy. Prior to law school, he worked as a secretary and stenographer to Colonel John B. Knox, railroad lawyer and president of the 1901 Alabama Constitutional Convention, who laid out the question of Negro domination as the issue driving state constitutional reform. "What is it we want to do?" Knox rhetorically asked the gathered delegates, answering, "Why, it is within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in the state." Although Knox justified past acts of fraud and terror against African American voters as acts of necessity for self-preservation against the menace of Negro domination, he recognized that the times called for new stratagems. With an eye toward their duty to posterity, Knox rallied the delegates to establish white supremacy by law. From John Knox Stern would receive his early lessons on law and politics in Alabama. In addition to receiving Knox's guidance, Stern, like many other young, well-to-do Southern white men, benefited immensely from the world that Knox helped to create. By quelling the ferment that came from black and dissenting white voters, disfranchisers like Knox created an illusion of order that made Southern politics more palpable to Northern observers. While elites could rely less on force or fraud because they had embodied in fundamental law such provisions as would protect the sanctity of the ballot. Disfranchisement allowed Southern Democrats to masquerade as Democrats. Moreover, the romantic haze in which groups like the UDC suffused memories of the antebellum South and the war also helped the region seem more noble than lawless. Thus, Stern could dare venture north to attend such a bastion of Yankee education as the Yale Law School because his parents and his mentor had effected the cultural and political coup that fostered regional reconciliation and assimilation. Stern, in short, was a child of reunion, and he could wear the mantle of white supremacy without ever uttering its name. Upon returning home to Alabama, Stern continued to reap the benefits of his association with Knox and his established membership in the white ruling class. In 1911, 3 years after graduating summa cum laude from law school, he became a junior partner in Knox's firm and a prominent citizen. He joined the Rotary Club, served on the board of Anniston's Carnegie Library, and began a lauded, ever-endless effort to better the community. By the time Edgar Caldwell tangled with the crew on his Klein's streetcar, Neil Stern was well on his way to becoming the irreplaceable, contributing influence in the business of the city that his friend Governor Thomas Kilby would one day eulogize him as having been. Neil Stern was not the only well-connected legal official Caldwell would face in the court. Like Neil Stern, Judge Hugh Merrill was the son of a Georgian Confederate soldier, and like the Sterns, The Merrills had moved from Georgia to northern Alabama during the political upheaval of the 1880s. They settled in neighboring Claiborne County, where Merrill's older brother Walter became head of the county's Democratic Party and a state senator. After graduating from the University of Alabama Law School in 1898, Hugh Merrill followed his brother into politics. He represented Claiborne County in the State House of Representatives from 1900 to 1901, the year of the Constitutional Convention. After his term in the Birmingham legislature, he moved to Anniston and took a job at John Knox's corporate law firm. Merrill's fortunes flourished in Anniston. He stayed in the Knox firm until the year after Stern left for law school. In 1906, he began a 2-year stint as Anniston's city attorney, working under the authority of then-Mayor Thomas Kilby. 5 years later, he began his first of 3 terms as a state circuit court judge. After the Caldwell case, Merrill would return to politics. He went on to become Speaker of the Alabama House and, during the early Depression years, the state's lieutenant governor. Both Merrill and Stern belonged to the local elite, linked by ties of kin and community in which law, business, and politics closely intermingled. An outsider, a stranger in the city, Edgar Caldwell had run afoul of some of the most powerful men in northern Alabama. The Negro Ministers' Union and other members of the black community watched with consternation as the full justice they had requested following the streetcar shooting got trampled in the authorities' lockstep march toward reprisal. On Thursday, the day after his preliminary hearing, Caldwell returned to the courthouse for a special convening of the circuit court grand jury called solely to hear his case. He only stayed for a few hours. After a 90-minute period of deliberation that even the Anniston Star found remarkably short, the grand jury returned an indictment charging the soldier with first-degree murder. According to Reverend Roland Williams, one of the signers of the Ministers' Union petition, the court later boasted of the grand jury's perfunctory consideration. The court's behavior made it apparent that African American leaders could no longer balance assertion and accommodation if they wished to save Caldwell's life. Sure that the soldier could not get a fair trial in Anniston with the passion so high. A group of local African Americans resolved to better his chances by using their own networks to counter the informal and institutional ties that united white authorities against him. If black soldiers had languished in Anniston because of the lack of unselfish leaders among Calhoun County's 15 black churches, the emergency occasioned by the streetcar shooting now moved area ministers to action. Banding together with small businessmen, they formed a legal committee to advocate for Caldwell. The Anniston Committee hired additional defense counsel, Basil Allen and Charles Klein, and launched a fundraising drive to pay the legal fees incurred. Recognizing that it had a significance that reached far beyond the Alabama hills, the committee also began pleading Caldwell's case to the NAACP in New York and to Special Assistant to the Secretary of War Emmett Scott in Washington, D.C. From his house on Brown Avenue in downtown Anniston, the 41-year-old Reverend Williams became the committee's spokesperson. The alternate public sphere that African Americans developed under Jim Crow provided the networks that linked the area's black middle class to each other and to the rest of the African American community. Although they could match white Anniston's upper classes neither in pedigree nor wealth, they could nevertheless surpass them in ingenuity and resolve. Even those folks without independent employment, people who could not afford to speak out publicly on behalf of Caldwell, could walk over to 10th Street and chat about his circumstances with their neighbors in Thomas Jackson's dry goods store. Domestics who worked for white people in Anniston or laborers who did custodial work for the white-owned Iron Works Company could keep their mouths shut but still place a little money for Caldwell in the offering plate at the Mount Zion Baptist Church. In the places where black public life happened, the shops and church halls and barber shops, people mulled over the Caldwell case. As Reverend Williams told the NAACP, they organized. The class divisions that normally stratified even small African American communities could compress or extend depending on circumstances. Although they might normally go their separate ways within the community, for Caldwell, the county's African Americans united. Long decades of resistance had taught African Americans to improvise a variety of tools to use in the fight against white supremacy, but the war supplied them with new ones. In addition to the discursive advantage presented by Wilsonian rhetoric and its disconnection from social realities, wartime mobilization helped to extend African American community networks out of their local setting and into the nation at large. Established civil rights groups, such as the NAACP, gained new branches and members during the war. Growing in numbers from 9,282 people in 80 branches in 1917 to 91,000 people in 310 branches by the end of 1919. While public campaigns for war funds and food production created new organizational infrastructures, to garner African American support for the Liberty Loan drives, for example, the government-organized committee of 100 brought together men from black churches, educational institutions, fraternal organizations, and commerce agencies. Moreover, these new networks also encouraged interracial cooperation in men and women's civic groups. Neil Stern, for example, sat on the board of Anniston's Liberty Loan Committee. Roland Williams served in its ranks. On Christmas Eve in Anniston, Roland Williams moved to harness, on behalf of Edgar Caldwell, these resources of war-related community organizations. In wavering handwriting on stationery he took from the United War Work Campaign, Reverend Williams informed the NAACP National Office that down in Anniston they faced a serious case that was being rushed through the courts for fear of mob violence. The defendant, Williams made sure to mention, was an active duty soldier, not discharged, with a fine record, and a long history of military service. Using wartime service as shorthand, he positioned himself as a community leader and transformed Caldwell from a common criminal to a worthy cause. Williams spoke in shorthand because, as he curtly informed the NAACP in his letter, what we do must be done quickly. As the court rushed through the preliminary proceedings, Caldwell's local defenders had little time to waste wooing outside help. The urgency only increased with the coming of the new year. Following the arraignment, where Caldwell entered a plea of not guilty, Judge Merrill scheduled the trial for January 17, 1919. The defense team twice moved for a continuance, arguing that the court had placed the case too early for the defendant to properly prepare for trial. Specifically, they needed time to seek out a soldier who was with the defendant at the time of shooting, whom the defendant had not yet been able to locate, but who they suspected might have returned to camp. They also sought a second eyewitness, a soldier named Nathaniel Phillips, who had been demobilized in the 3 weeks since the shooting. Caldwell and his defense teams continued to maintain that someone else had shot the transportation workers. The court denied both motions to delay the trial but granted the defense permission to summarize the testimony of the discharged soldier. In January 1919, while dozens of African Americans endeavored to get to France to perform and reinforce black citizenship during the peace conference, African American Annistonians looked to the courthouse as the next theater of the struggle. I feel, Reverend Williams wrote after Caldwell's arraignment, like this is a test case of what is coming to us after war. The black and white citizens of Calhoun County who thronged the courthouse a week later felt much the same way. African Americans, coming from all parts of the county, pressed into the courtroom until it was practically impossible to get in or out. When Judge Merrill ordered the court cleared of anyone without a seat, insistent spectators stooped at cracks in the door to continue listening to the muffled proceedings. Under Merrill's orders, the police cleared them away as well. The trial remained a public event despite the restricted access to the courthouse. African Americans barred from the building gathered on the road in front, creating an impromptu open-air forum for discussing the trial. Most could have agreed with Reverend Williams' statement that the race here sees prejudice in the court here. Looking around the courtroom, they would never even have expected to see a jury of their peers. Despite the best intentions of the 14th Amendment, the broad discretionary powers given to judges, prosecutors, and local administrators would keep Southern trial juries and the right of law in the hands of white men until well into the 1950s. They might well have noted, also, that there were no good white folks on the jury, as the men free from race prejudice were easily struck by the state, early in the process. Some optimists in the crowd might have speculated about whether the legal committee's attorney, Basil Allen, former judge and reputedly one of the best lawyers in the state, could improve Caldwell's odds. Given the animosity that the country's white communities radiated toward the soldier, few people likely held out much hope. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to leave those comments down below. I would love to hear from you guys about these excerpts. So make sure to like this video. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you could continue on with me in my reading of racism in America.